I'd like to discuss an idea that I consider generally original concerning the so-called hard problem of consciousness. The idea arises from a deep epistemological reflection on the structural limitations of scientific knowledge when it confronts subjective experience. I believe that the hard problem of consciousness may not be unresolved scientific problem, but rather a transcendental aporia in the Kantian sense of the term. Let us try to question a tacit premise that almost everyone accepts without examining it, namely, that the hard problem is in principle solvable with more data, more neuroscience, or greater computational power. Well, my thesis is more radical. Well, the so-called hard problem of consciousness can be seen as a genuine Kantian aporia, and therefore as a problem that is structurally inaccessible to human cognition. Let me explain more clearly. To understand how neural correlates give rise to subjective experience would require the existence of some kind of decoding equation that maps neurobiological states onto phenomenal contents. However, the measurement of conscious experience is possible only from the inside. That is, from the point of view of the subject who lives it. It follows that the system to be observed coincides with the only observational instrument available. And that's why, as mentioned earlier, the problem thus becomes intrinsically self-referential and, as such, not merely difficult at the empirical level, but insoluble at the epistemological level. Let me clarify why. The parallel with Kant is not metaphorical but formal. Why? Well, in Kant, there are problems that are not solvable not because data are lacking, but because they exceed the conditions of possibility of knowledge. The antinomies of pure reason are not mistakes. They are signs that reason has overstepped its legitimate domain. The hard problem lies exactly in this zone. Science operates at the level of observable phenomena, that is, on quantities accessible from a third-person perspective. Now, phenomenal consciousness, what we call the qualia, is by definition first-personal and cannot be objectified without destroying its very nature. Asking how neural activity becomes experience is, in Kantian terms, equivalent to asking how the noumenos becomes phenomenon while remaining noumenon. It is a question that is ill-posed from a transcendental point of view. And the decisive point is decoding equation is logically impossible. Now, why my intuition about the decoding equation is crucial? Let me formalize the problem. Suppose there exists a function f of neural states equals subjective experience. To validate such a function, we would need, first, a reliable measure of neural state, and that's possible, that's feasible. Second, a reliable measure of subjective experience, and this is where the system collapses. The only sensor of experience is experience itself, There is no independent verification channel. Any report is mediated by language, already a cognitive transformation of experience, not the experience as such. And this introduces an irremediable epistemic circularity. The system that should be measured is also the only measuring instrument. And this is not a contingent technological limitation. It is a negative theorem about the kind of object consciousness is. Now let's come to the strong self-referentiality. I call it strong, not weak. Here we are not dealing with a simple Gödel-type self-reference. We are dealing with something more radical. Consciousness is simultaneously the object and the condition of possibility of observation, simultaneously the system and the metasystem. You cannot step outside consciousness in order to measure it without annihilating it as an experience. Every attempt of objectification produces only correlates, never phenomenic identity. But let's put it more bluntly. Consciousness is not hidden. It is logically not externalizable. Why neural correlates do not solve and cannot solve the problem? Neural correlates of consciousness, NCCs, work extremely well as long as they remain correlates. Well, they can tell us when an experience is present, which content is likely, how intensity varies, which structures are necessary. But they will never explain why there is something it is like to be that system. This is not a failure of neuroscience. It is a success. Neuroscience is doing exactly what it can do, namely the science of observable phenomena. To demand that it solve the hard problem is like demanding that Newtonian mechanics explain why space exists. And let me tell you something that you may not like it. Chalmers is right about the problem, but perhaps he's wrong about the final diagnosis. Chalmers correctly identifies irreducibility, but tends to treat it as a new ontological domain, such as fundamental properties and naturalistic dualism. The Kantian reading is more sober and paradoxically more radical. There is no need to posit new entities. It is sufficient to recognize a transcendental limit of explanation. The hard problem is not a gap to be filled, but a boundary to be acknowledged. Now, a strong but honest conclusion. Yes, the hard problem of consciousness can be understood as a structural aporia of human cognition, grounded in the first-personal nature of experience, aggravated by ineliminable self-referentiality, and therefore insoluble not empirically but logically. This does not mean that consciousness is mysterious in a mystical sense. It means that not everything that exists is translatable into the third person. Science can map the territory up to the boundary, but the boundary is not the territory, and it is already a great achievement to identify it clearly rather than continuing to crash it into while pretending it is a merely lack of data. So here, paradoxically, Kant and the most advanced neuroscience end up shaking hands.